It was a Saturday evening, and I was planted firmly on the couch, watching the big game. My team was up by 1, and the final minutes were ticking down. Lauren appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm light of the hallway. She wore a light cocktail dress, her blonde hair styled neatly, and a small silver clutch hung from her hand. She said, "Mike, I'm heading out to Carol's for a girls' night. We've been planning this for weeks, and the girls are already waiting. Don't get too bored without me, alright?" I nodded and gave her a smile. Trust wasn't something I struggled with, especially not with Lauren. But as we all know, life has a way of presenting little cracks when you least expect them. Hours later, well past midnight, I turned off the TV and stretched. The house was silent. Checking my phone, I saw her message, "On my way home, had a great night. Love you." It all seemed perfectly fine. Yet, for some reason, a faint unease prickled at the back of my mind. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to post-midnight paranoia, and went to bed. The next morning, I was up early. After a long shower, I returned to the bedroom to grab a shirt from the dresser. Lauren was still asleep, facing the wall, her blonde hair sprawled across the pillow. On the nightstand next to her small silver purse, I noticed a folded receipt peeking out. It was from an upscale Italian restaurant downtown, a place we'd only been to on special occasions. Curious, I picked it up. The date and time matched last night. 2 meals, 2 glasses of wine, 1 shared dessert. My brows furrowed. This didn't line up with her story about a quiet bar with the girls. I set the receipt back exactly as I found it and went downstairs to make coffee. When Lauren eventually wandered into the kitchen, she looked tired but content. I kept my voice casual. "How was your night? I hope you guys didn't overdo it on the cocktails." She laughed lightly and said, "No, it was perfect. Just a cozy little bar, not many people, lots of laughs." Her answer was smooth, effortless. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the image of that restaurant receipt. I let it slide, for the moment. Overthinking things wasn't my style, and I wasn't about to start micromanaging my wife's nights out. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little more attentive after that. A few days later, another incident planted a seed of doubt. I was sitting in the living room after work, flipping through channels, when Lauren's phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up, a message from Emily. It read, "Thanks for covering for me." My stomach tightened slightly. Emily was one of Lauren's work friends, and while I wasn't one to snoop, the phrasing struck me as odd. Lauren walked into the room moments later, fresh out of the shower, wrapped in a towel. I nodded towards her phone and said, "Emily texted. Everything okay?" She picked up the phone and read the message with a casual smile. "Oh, yeah. She messed up an office report yesterday, and I smoothed things over with her manager. She's just thanking me for that." Without hesitation, she scrolled through their chat and showed me their conversation. It was all work-related. I nodded, satisfied on the surface, but a tiny voice inside me refused to go quiet. It was all too perfect, her response, the proof, the casual way she handled it. But again, there was no tangible reason to push further, so I let it go. The final straw came a few nights later. Lauren had another girls' night planned. This time, as she left the house, I felt something stir in my gut, an instinct I couldn't ignore. After she drove off, I decided to check her car. I wasn't proud of myself for doing it, but something felt off. I walked out into the driveway and opened the trunk. Inside was a crumpled hoodie, a men's hoodie. It smelled faintly of cologne, something sharp and unfamiliar. I held it for a moment, my jaw tightening. Could it have belonged to one of the husbands? Maybe someone had tossed it into Lauren's car by mistake. I closed the trunk and walked back inside, my mind churning. When Lauren returned later that night, I was sitting in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone. She walked in, kicked off her heels, and smiled at me. I waited a beat before saying, "Hey, I found a hoodie in your trunk earlier. Smelled like some guy's cologne. Any idea whose it is?" She paused for a fraction of a second before laughing. "Oh. That's Mark's hoodie. He's Carol's husband. He picked us up from the bar last time and must have left it in my car. I'll text Carol now and double-check." She pulled out her phone, typed a message, and showed me the screen. Moments later, Carol responded, "Oh my gosh, yes. Mark's been looking for that hoodie everywhere. Thanks, Lauren." It was airtight, again. Every loose end tied up, every question answered seamlessly. Lauren was either the most innocent person alive or the smoothest liar I'd ever met. In the days that followed, I found myself watching her more closely, not in an obvious way, but in the way you watch someone when you're trying to piece together a puzzle. She wasn't acting suspiciously, in fact, she seemed genuinely at ease. But that was part of the problem. Every detail, every answer, every explanation, it all fell perfectly into place. Too perfectly. I started paying more attention to the little things. Her schedule. Her phone habits. The way she spoke about her nights out with the girls. Nothing outwardly screamed guilt, but something didn't sit right. One evening, while Lauren was out running errands, I sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook. I started jotting down every odd detail, every small inconsistency, every moment that had given me pause. The receipt. The text message. The hoodie. Individually, they were explainable. Together, they painted a murkier picture. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. I wasn't paranoid, and I wasn't going to turn into some obsessive investigator. But I also wasn't going to ignore my instincts. Something was off, and I needed to know what. And that's when it hit me, it wasn't about catching Lauren in a lie. It wasn't about confronting her with suspicions. It was about clarity, about knowing the truth, whatever it might be. I closed the notebook, exhaled slowly, and looked out the window into the darkening sky. It seemed that I had a little investigating to do. After the string of strange coincidences, I decided to stop brushing off my doubts. I wasn't paranoid, but something deep in my gut wouldn't let me rest. Lauren was smart, careful, and always had a flawless explanation ready. Yet, I was methodical, a planner by nature. If there was something to uncover, I would do it quietly, efficiently, and without her ever realizing it. One evening, Lauren told me she was heading out for another girls' night. As she grabbed her purse and keys, I gave her a casual smile and a kiss on the cheek. Once her car disappeared down the street, I went into the garage, retrieved a small GPS tracker I had ordered online, and carefully attached it under the rear bumper of her car. It took me less than 5 minutes, and I made sure it was secured and out of sight. I wasn't planning to follow her in real time, I wasn't that kind of man, but I'd check the route later when she was back. The next morning, while Lauren was still asleep, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and opened the tracking app on my phone. The route was mostly predictable, straight downtown, some stops near familiar locations. But then, something caught my eye. At one point, her car had veered off the main road and stopped in a quiet suburban area. It wasn't near a bar, restaurant, or any place you'd expect someone out for drinks with friends to be. Just a residential neighborhood. I stared at the map, my finger hovering over the blinking dot. Maybe they stopped by someone's house. I thought. When Lauren came downstairs later, I brought it up casually. "Did you guys stop anywhere unexpected last night?" I asked while pouring her coffee. Without missing a beat, she said, "Oh, Jenny forgot her phone at home, so we swung by her place to grab it. She's so forgetful sometimes." Her answer was smooth, quick, and believable. But that odd feeling lingered. Everything Lauren said always seemed perfect, too perfect. I nodded, feigning satisfaction, and dropped the subject. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that pinpoint on the map. A few days later, Lauren told me she'd be attending a work conference. It was supposed to be an all-day event in the city. That morning, after she left, I picked up my phone and dialed her office, posing as a courier who needed to deliver a package directly to Lauren. The receptionist on the other end was polite but firm. "Lauren's working remotely today," she said confidently. My stomach tightened. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment, processing what I'd just heard. Lauren had said she was at a conference, yet her office had her listed as working remotely. Why lie about something so small? It didn't add up. When Lauren came home that evening, she greeted me with the same warmth and ease as always. Over dinner, I asked her, "How was the conference? Who did you get to talk to?" Without hesitation, she started naming colleagues, mentioning how productive the day had been. She even said she'd share some photos with me tomorrow. And true to her word, the next day, she showed me a few snapshots, generic office scenes, people sitting at tables, coffee cups, paperwork scattered about. Everything looked normal. But I couldn't forget the receptionist's voice, clear, confident, and absolutely certain Lauren wasn't in the office that day. My suspicions grew, piece by piece, forming an incomplete but troubling picture. The GPS tracker, the phone call, the seamless explanations, they all painted Lauren as someone who was either entirely innocent or incredibly good at covering her tracks. I couldn't decide which, and that ambiguity gnawed at me. I began watching her more closely, not in an obvious way, but subtly. I paid attention to her comings and goings, the way she glanced at her phone, the timing of her messages. Every now and then, something small would raise a red flag, a hesitation in her voice, a glance that lingered a second too long. One evening, I decided to confront her, not aggressively, but directly. We were in the living room, and I turned off the TV. "Lauren," I said, my voice steady, "is there something you're not telling me?" Her expression changed instantly. She looked hurt, offended even. "What do you mean?" she asked. I laid out the inconsistencies, the GPS stop in the suburbs, the conference that wasn't, the hoodie in her trunk. Lauren's face flushed with anger. She said she couldn't believe I didn't trust her, that I was acting paranoid and unfair. The argument escalated quickly, and by the end of it, she stormed upstairs, leaving me alone in the silent living room. For the next week, we barely spoke. Lauren avoided eye contact, stayed late at work, and retreated to the bedroom early each night. The silence between us was suffocating, and I started to question whether I'd gone too far. But here's the thing, if Lauren was hiding something that could end our marriage, I needed to know for certain. Not just for my own peace of mind, but because there was more at stake. If this ended in divorce, there would be property, finances, and years of shared life to untangle. I couldn't afford to confront her again without undeniable proof. So, I made a decision. I wouldn't push any further for now. I'd let things settle, let her guard drop again. In the meantime, I'd plan carefully. If Lauren was being dishonest, I'd catch her, not with gut feelings or circumstantial evidence, but with hard, irrefutable proof. I spent the next few nights sketching out my approach. No more slip-ups, no more impulsive confrontations. I'd be precise, methodical, and above all, patient. As I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the notes I'd made, one thought anchored itself firmly in my mind. If my plan didn't work, I had one final card to play, one ace up my sleeve. So, for now, I decided to retreat. But make no mistake, I had a plan. And if it failed, I still had my trump card. I never wanted my life to turn into some kind of detective novel, but my gut wouldn't let me rest. There was something Lauren wasn't telling me, something she was deliberately keeping hidden. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was important. But I also realized that I couldn't do this alone anymore. Lauren was careful, methodical, and always seemed one step ahead. If I wanted answers, I needed to be smarter. I needed help. Becky was my first move. She was one of Lauren's closest friends, chatty, a little naive, and not particularly good at keeping secrets. I met her at a local cafe, under the guise of planning an anniversary surprise for Lauren. It didn't take much to get her talking. "Becky, has Lauren been okay lately? I feel like she's been distant. Like something's bothering her." Becky's eyes widened, and she leaned in closer, her voice dropping slightly. "You know, Mike, now that you mention it, she has been acting a little strange. Canceling plans, always rushing somewhere, and sometimes, when we ask her what's up, she just shrugs it off or changes the subject." I kept my expression neutral, nodding along. Becky continued, almost hesitantly. "She mentioned something about a hospital once." It was quick, like she didn't mean to say it, and then she changed the subject immediately. "Maybe she's dealing with something health-related." I thanked Becky, played up the concerned husband role, and left the cafe with a slightly heavier chest. A hospital? Lauren had never mentioned anything about health problems to me. If it was something serious, why would she keep it a secret? Next, I turned to Tom. Tom was slippery, the kind of guy who would do anything for the right amount of cash. I waited for him near his office parking lot after hours. When he spotted me leaning against my car, he smirked. "Tom," I said directly, handing him a folded stack of bills, "I need you to keep an eye on Lauren at work. Nothing creepy, just notice if she's acting strange. If she makes calls, if she disappears for hours, anything out of the ordinary." Tom pocketed the money and shrugged. "Sure, man. Whatever you say." A few days later, Tom texted me. "Nothing too weird. She's working fine. But a couple of times, she stepped out to make phone calls. Used her personal phone, went into a private conference room. Sounded tense, though. Like the calls were important." I asked Tom if he could figure out who she was calling, but he didn't have answers. What he did tell me, however, was that one of those calls was definitely to a hospital. He'd seen her searching for a medical center's number on her phone. Two people now, Becky and Tom, both mentioned a hospital. Lauren still hadn't said a word to me about it. My third move was more subtle. I reached out to Kevin, one of those mutual friends who straddles the line between both sides of a couple's life. Kevin was trustworthy, but he also liked being in the loop. I didn't frame it as suspicion, instead, I played it like curiosity. "Kevin, I think Lauren's planning something big. Maybe a surprise, maybe something else, I don't know. But she's been so distracted lately, and I can't figure it out. Can you talk to her? Just, feel things out. I'm dying to know if it's something good." Kevin laughed and agreed. A few days later, he called me. "Mike, buddy. I don't know what to tell you. I had coffee with Lauren, and she was tense. Like her mind was somewhere else. She kept checking her phone, watching the time. And yeah, she mentioned she had an important appointment at a hospital coming up in a couple of weeks. But when I tried to ask about it, she brushed it off and joked that I was being nosy. 3 people. 3 mentions of a hospital. And still, Lauren hadn't said a single word about it to me. It wasn't just the secrecy, it was the pattern. Lauren wasn't someone who made careless mistakes. She was calculated, composed, always in control of her narrative. If she hadn't told me about this, it wasn't an oversight, it was intentional. I spent the next few days thinking it over. Maybe it was health-related, something serious that she didn't want to burden me with. But if that was the case, why drop hints to others and keep me in the dark? Maybe it wasn't about her health at all. Maybe it was something, or someone, else entirely. The doubt clawed at me, keeping me up at night. I couldn't ask her directly again. The last time I had confronted her, it nearly tore us apart. Lauren was too good at deflecting, too quick with her perfect answers. I needed something stronger than suspicions. I needed facts, something undeniable, something I could hold in my hands. So, I decided it was time to play my trump card. I had one final move, one ace left in my sleeve. Whether it revealed a medical issue, another person, or something else entirely, I would know the truth. I had to be ready for any outcome. Whether it was something heartbreaking or something unforgivable, I had to know. I never thought I'd have to involve my father in something like this, but desperate times call for desperate measures. My father, Harold, was a retired detective, a man who could read people like an open book and notice details others would overlook. Despite being out of the game for years, his sharp eyes and analytical mind were still intact. When I showed up at his small house on the edge of town, he was already waiting at the door. "Something serious, son?" he asked the moment I stepped inside. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything, every suspicion, every detail I'd gathered, every strange encounter with Lauren. He listened intently, his face unreadable, his sharp eyes fixed on me. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's dig deeper." Harold wasn't one to waste time. He had an old-school approach to investigation, quiet observation, subtle questions, and a keen eye for human behavior. His first move was what he called the observation point. He positioned himself in a small cafe across from the medical center where Lauren had allegedly been visiting. It was an unassuming place, quiet, with large windows offering a clear view of the clinic's entrance. Harold spent an entire day there, nursing cups of coffee and scribbling notes in a worn-out notebook. But Harold wasn't just watching, he was gathering information. At some point, he struck up a conversation with a young waitress named Maggie, a friendly girl who often served hospital staff and patients. Harold had a way of getting people to talk without them even realizing it. Maggie mentioned that a pretty blonde woman with a nice smile and an expensive handbag sometimes came in. Always alone. Always sitting in the farthest corner, facing away from the entrance. When Harold showed her Lauren's photo, Maggie confirmed, it was her. That detail stuck out to Harold. Lauren wasn't just visiting the clinic casually, she was making a point to avoid being seen. Next, Harold turned to one of his old tricks, a phone call, carefully planned and deceptively simple. He called the dental clinic under the guise of an old patient. "Hello," he said politely. "I wanted to check if Dr. Wilkes is still taking patients. My wife saw him a while back, and she won't stop talking about how great he was." The receptionist chuckled. "Oh, Dr. Wilkes. He's very exclusive these days. He only sees select patients." Select patients. That phrase hung in Harold's mind like a neon sign. Lauren wasn't visiting just any dentist, she was part of a select group of patients who had access to this elusive Dr. Wilkes. But Harold wasn't done yet. He had one more play, a move straight out of an old detective novel. He went to the parking lot behind the clinic. Wearing an old electrician's badge he had kept from a past case, he pretended to check the building's electrical boxes while subtly surveying the security cameras. Several cameras had a clear view of the clinic's back entrance. Harold took note of the security company's name and made a few calls to some old contacts. By the next day, Harold had footage in his hands. On one of the clips, clear as day, was Lauren. She was walking out of the clinic, talking to a man in a white coat, a man who was undoubtedly Dr. Wilkes. Their body language was far too personal for a typical doctor-patient interaction. Lauren's expression was softer, almost vulnerable. She wasn't just talking to a dentist, this was something deeper. When Harold showed me the footage that evening, we sat together at his kitchen table, the glow from the overhead light reflecting off the tablet screen. I watched Lauren on that grainy footage, talking to Dr. Wilkes, her face partially obscured by her hair. "She's hiding something," I muttered. Harold set down the tablet and crossed his arms. "Mike, everything points to this dentist. But listen to me carefully, if you confront him directly, he'll shut down. If there's something going on, he'll cover his tracks. That's not the way to get answers. So what do we do?" I asked, my voice low. Harold leaned back in his chair, his weathered face serious. Then he smirked faintly, that old detective glint flashing in his eyes. "We go through his wife." It took me a moment to process what he was saying. His wife? Yeah. If there's anyone who knows his secrets, it's her. And trust me, Mike, people like Dr. Wilkes always have secrets. His wife will know more than she lets on, whether she realizes it or not. Harold had a plan, and it was already taking shape in his mind. He explained it to me in careful detail, how we'd approach her, what we'd say, and how we'd ensure she never realized she was being played. As Harold spoke, the gravity of the situation settled into my chest. This wasn't just suspicion anymore, this was a full-fledged investigation. And the stakes felt higher than ever. Outside the window, night had fallen. The quiet hum of crickets filled the air, broken only by the occasional distant bark of a dog. Harold finished laying out the plan and leaned back, his eyes sharp and knowing. "And there you have it," he said calmly. "We'll start with her. If she knows something, and trust me, she does, we'll get it out of her." The room felt heavy with silence. Harold stared at me, waiting for my response. I nodded slowly, my resolve hardening. Harold smirked faintly and leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I have one idea, and if it works, we'll finally have the truth." Outside, the night stretched on, full of silence, shadows, and the weight of what was to come. The next day, my father Harold and I stood in front of Dr. Wilkes' suburban home. Both of us were dressed in sharp suits, giving off an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. Harold clutched his old, worn detective badge in his hand, the same one that had once granted him access to places others couldn't reach. The house in front of us was pristine, the lawn perfectly manicured, and white curtains hung neatly in the windows. It was the kind of house where secrets hid in plain sight. The door opened after a few knocks, revealing Ashley Wilkes, the dentist's wife. She was petite, with carefully styled hair and a nervous expression that she tried to mask with a polite smile. "Who are you? What's this about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Harold stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Detective Harold Phelps, ma'am. We need to have a serious conversation. It's important." Ashley hesitated, her hand gripping the doorknob tightly. After a few moments, she stepped aside and let us in. The living room was cozy, decorated with neutral tones and family photos. But there was tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Ashley's hands trembled slightly as she poured us glasses of water, avoiding eye contact. Harold sat down across from her, leaning forward slightly. His voice dropped, steady and unyielding. "Listen carefully, Mrs. Wilkes. Your husband might be involved in something inappropriate. There are signs, connections to another woman, secret meetings, strange behavior. This isn't just some harmless fling. There's something bigger at play here, and people could get hurt." Ashley's face went pale, and she swallowed hard. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but Harold cut her off, his tone sharper now. "Look, if you don't tell us what you know, your husband could end up in serious trouble. We're talking about prison, serious consequences. And let me tell you, ma'am, no one's serving him sandwiches in there. And you'll be left to pick up the pieces. Alone." Ashley's composure broke. Tears welled in her eyes, and she stammered, I don't know much, but there have been strange things happening. He's been different." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "A few weeks ago, he told me he had an evening appointment with a patient, but I checked his schedule later, and there was nothing booked. He came home late that night, smelling like someone else's perfume." Harold exchanged a quick glance with me but let her keep talking. "There's more," Ashley whispered. "I found a small box in his car last week. A jewelry box. It was expensive, I could tell just by looking at it. But when I asked him about it, he brushed me off and said it was nothing." The details were piling up, each one sharper than the last. Ashley continued, her voice shaking. "He's also been locking himself in his office at the clinic more often. There's a new door there with an electronic lock. I've never seen him act like this before. He takes calls late at night, whispers into the phone, and sometimes, he disappears for hours without telling me where he's going." She stopped, clutching a crumpled tissue in her hand. Harold leaned back, his face expressionless but his mind clearly racing. "Thank you, Ashley," Harold said, his voice softer now. "You've been very helpful. But listen to me carefully, if you tell your husband about this conversation, everything we've done here will fall apart. If he realizes we're onto him, he'll cover his tracks, and we'll lose any chance of finding the truth." Ashley's tears spilled over, and she nodded rapidly. "I won't say anything. Please, don't let anything happen to him." Harold handed her a card with his number on it. "If you notice anything else, anything at all, call this number immediately. And keep your suspicions to yourself." We left the house in silence, stepping out into the cool afternoon air. Harold let out a long breath and rubbed his temple. "She knows more than she's letting on," he muttered. "But she's scared, scared of what she might find out, scared of what happens next." I nodded, processing everything we just heard. "Do you think this is personal, Dad? Something between Lauren and him, or something else?" Harold's jaw tightened, and he gave a grim nod. "It's personal. But it's also bigger than just an affair. There's something else at play here, something they're both tangled up in." The days that followed were filled with a steady stream of updates from Ashley. She messaged Harold almost daily, each piece of information adding another layer to the puzzle. She mentioned midnight phone calls, secret meetings in upscale restaurants, and whispered conversations behind closed doors. But one detail stood out among the rest: some of these meetings didn't happen in bars or restaurants, they happened in private rooms at the clinic. Specifically, behind that new electronically locked door in Dr. Wilkes' office. That door wasn't just a random addition to the clinic, it was a gateway to whatever secret Lauren and Dr. Wilkes were hiding. As I sat in the dim light of my living room, staring at the collection of notes, messages, and fragments of truth scattered before me, a realization began to form in my mind. There was a way to catch them, a way to uncover the truth, once and for all. It was risky, but it was our best shot. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. I knew how to catch them. I knew the opportunity one had to expose whatever it was they were hiding. And I wasn't going to waste it. The plan Harold and I put together was meticulous. Every detail accounted for, every contingency considered. The goal was simple. I needed to get into Dr. Wilkes' office, see that electronic lock, inspect the room, and gather whatever evidence I could find. But the execution? That was going to require precision. Harold warned me multiple times before I left. Stay sharp, son. If something feels off, pull out. Don't take unnecessary risks. This camera is our only witness if things go south. I nodded, fastening the tiny camera to the inside of my shirt collar. Harold's words hung heavy in my mind as I prepared myself. To gain access to the clinic without suspicion, I needed an excuse, a reason to be there. So, I played my part. I started complaining about a sharp, persistent toothache. I groaned, held my cheek, and winced at all the right moments. Lauren noticed immediately. You should see someone about that, Mike, she said, her voice tight and overly enthusiastic. Dr. Wilkes is excellent. You should make an appointment with him right away. Tomorrow, even. Her insistence was unnerving. There was no hesitation, no suggestion of alternatives, just an immediate push towards Dr. Wilkes. It wasn't just concern, it was desperation. It was as if she needed me to go there. The next morning, I walked into the clinic. The smell of antiseptic and the hum of fluorescent lights hit me as soon as I entered. A nurse greeted me at the reception desk and guided me to one of the examination rooms. The walls were sterile white, and the equipment gleamed under the bright lights. Dar. Wilkes entered, wearing his polished smile and sharp white coat. He was tall, confident, and carried himself with an air of authority that made my skin crawl. Mr. Phelps, he said, extending his hand. Let's see what we're dealing with today. I let him examine me briefly before he said I'd need a local anesthetic. I nodded, trying to appear calm, but inside, my pulse was racing. As the sedative began to take effect, my vision blurred slightly, and my limbs felt heavy. But I wasn't completely out. My ears still picked up fragments of sound, and my eyes could still register shapes and movement. That's when the door opened. Through the haze, I saw Lauren walk into the room. Her voice was muffled but clear enough. Is he under? She asked. Completely, Wilkes replied. I couldn't move, but I could see. I could hear. Lauren moved closer to him. Their bodies were too close. Her hand brushed against his chest. Their voices dipped into whispers, but their tones carried something unmistakable, a level of intimacy that stabbed through my chest like a hot knife. And then she knelt down. My stomach turned, and despite the sedation, I felt bile rise in my throat. They thought I couldn't see them. They thought I was just a lump of flesh strapped to a chair, unaware of the betrayal unfolding in front of me. I don't know how long it went on. Minutes? Hours? Time lost all meaning. But eventually, my senses began to return. I could feel the leather of the chair beneath my fingers. I could hear their muffled laughter. My pulse thundered in my ears. I glanced at the tray of instruments next to me. My hand moved slowly, almost instinctively, and closed around a sharp dental tool. My knuckles turned white as I gripped it tightly. Hey! My voice came out raw, guttural, breaking through the tension like glass shattering on a cold floor. Both of them froze. Lauren's face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth. Wilkes staggered backward, knocking over a tray in his panic. What? How? Lauren stammered, her voice cracking. I was on my feet now, the dental tool still clenched in my hand, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. What the hell is this? I barked, my voice trembling with rage. The door burst open. Nurses rushed in, followed closely by a security guard. The scene must have looked insane, a disoriented man holding a sharp tool, a half-dressed dentist, and a woman clutching a white coat to her chest. Drop the instrument, sir, one of the nurses screamed. I let the tool clatter to the floor and took a step back, breathing heavily. No one tried to stop me as I walked out of that room. No one said a word as I left the clinic, my ears ringing, my vision swimming with red. When I got home, I didn't stop moving. I went upstairs, grabbed Lauren's suitcases, and began packing. I didn't care what I threw in, clothes, makeup, shoes, it all went into the bags. Every drawer was emptied, every trace of her existence in our home was erased in a matter of minutes. I carried the suitcases to the porch, set them down, and shut the door behind me. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. My phone buzzed. "Lauren, please, Mike. Please talk to me. I can explain." I stared at the screen for a moment, my chest tightening. But there was nothing left to say. I typed my response carefully, each word like a nail in the coffin of our marriage. "We're divorcing. This is the end." I hit send and set the phone down on the kitchen counter. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty suitcases on the porch. This chapter was over. The damage was done. And there was no going back. The days following the clinic incident felt surreal. My body moved on autopilot as I gathered all the evidence,